You swiftly craft a crude map of the cosmos in the air with your hands as you speak the words of the spell, creating glowing orrery of threads of magic that materialize out of the air. You strike a tuning fork against this construct and hold it close to the place among the planes you wish to go. You tilt the singing piece of metal, seeking the perfect note for your destination, and when it is close, you encourage your companions to prepare themselves. Oh man, I love these scribes descriptors, they are so cool, though there is something even cooler, and that is our sponsor for today's video. This video is brought to you by Reroll once again, because I love them so much, I wanted to bring them back for you all. Reroll functions as a character sheet app where you can create your characters in there and set up all of the normal stats that you would on any sheet app. HP, stats, skills, items, really everything that you would expect. However, the twist is that you can reflect how your character actually looks like through those items. You can create the physical look of your character and then design the look of the weapons and armor that he collects in the game. There are a large variety of options in here for you to choose from, making your character completely unique from most others, especially because every single piece can be colored individually. This here is Rex, the bronze dragonborn paladin. He got himself a cool, sweet dragon-styled shield, a longsword, and his trusty pet Ghosta, the white dragon baby. I added in the watery background because I'm still currently DMing Ghost of Saltmarsh, so that's where my mind is at. But yeah, you can create your character sheet in here alongside a highly customizable character creator. But this is also cool too because you can grab this image and very easily export it out so that you can then drop the image on Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or use it as a profile pic wherever you want. The app is great, definitely check it out. It is on the Google Store, on the App Store, and on PC as well. You can access it through the browser like I have been, so just go over to reroll.co, that is reroll.co, to check this out. So now, let's get back into the video. So in our last episode, we talked about the border ethereal and the barrier that separates the border and the deep ethereal. Well, today, we're going in deep, very deep. We'll talk about what's out there in this infinite plane of possibilities, what worlds can be found floating in the ether, and what dangers one might befall if you but stray too far. Quote, streamers of vapor emerge from nothingness, swirling masses of mist, first blue, then aquamarine, then emerald swirled with crimson, all in continuous and ever-changing patterns, shroud a body's vision. Worlds of fog and shadowy shapes of varying solidity float in and out of view. A few blobs of solid ether lazily sail end over end, some gaining density and others losing it. Clear windows open onto scenes both familiar and alien before losing resolution in the slow, chaotic boil of the ethereal plane. End quote. A person that enters the deep, as they call it, would see a world of fog of various colors. Behind them, they would see the color wall, which is the door, so to speak, to the world they just left. The wall would look like the Aurora Borealis, with near infinite looking length and size, but no discernible depth. Looking forward again, they would notice that they can only look so far as the fog is everywhere. The fog is, of course, unrealized matter, space, and time to be. The building block of the multiverse, the stuff of creation, or at least what comes before matter is molded. You would notice immediately that you can breathe it. Quote, the ethereal plane is filled with ethereal particles that have bled off the inner planes. These particles combine to form the ethereal fog, minuscule packets of possibility. A body breathing the fog automatically translates possibility into reality. The mist becomes a nourishing gas appropriate to the breather. End quote. However, since the fog is composed of the elements of the inner plane, you can find yourself in contact with bad ethereal fog, that being fog that might have a little bit too much of the inner plane of fire or too much of the inner plane of smoke. Breathing particles like such that have too much of an element can be, of course, indeed very deadly, but for the most part, most of the plane is perfectly breathable, which is really cool. In any case though, this same process actually applies to sustenance, where you can use the ethereal fog for food, but it is much more complicated. Just eating the fog is not gonna quite do the trick, I'm sorry to say. Instead, you must develop a form of bond with the plane and then slowly over time sort of acclimate yourself enough to be able to eat it. or absorb it, depending on how you do it. It might take a few years, of course, but with enough acclimation, eventually your body would start adapting to the fog as a form of sustenance. That being said, that is not really necessary, actually. You can just bring your food and drink over into the Ethereal without any issues, and it works just fine and tastes just the same. Actually, it doesn't taste quite as good, but it works. As far as vision is concerned, you can typically see up to 300 feet in front of you before things start to get muffled up by the fog. And even though the shades and darkness and light work just the same in the Ethereal, darkness is typically never a problem since the particles in the Ethereal fog illuminate around them. The massive amounts of illumination coming from everywhere does not cause warmth, however. Temperatures in here are actually meaningless. You don't feel them at all. A warm area does not radiate any heat. Neither would you feel cold by just being floating out here in this space. As far as other senses are concerned, hearing increases in the Ethereal as sound travels twice as far in the thick, possibility-laden medium, though smelling becomes more difficult. The lack of definite boundaries prevents odors from permeating a space, and so tracking in this way is extremely hard in here. Lastly though, and in general, your touching senses sort of lose some of their sharpness. Food doesn't quite taste as good and it feels funny in your mouth, and objects feel somewhat pliant and rubbery in your hands. Quote, "For this reason, some cutters carry spices that are so devastating that they are banned on all but the lower planes. These spices, including devilwort, goreen, and even mepho sweat, are damaging when eaten by most bloods on other planes, but perfect to add flavor to food made bland by the Ethereal." End quote. Now, all of this can be very overwhelming for people, and I mean, lots of folk out there get seasick while out in the sea, and others literally can't handle putting on a VR headset without needing to sit down and rest. Hell, I know a person who can't play games with motion blur on, or he gets sick. So you can easily imagine how traumatizing your first experience in the deep can be. Well, this type of sickness has a name, and it is called ether sickness. When you lose all sense of space and float freely into the mists, being hit and buffeted by the winds and vapors, you can very easily get disoriented and become ether sick. This is considered to be a severe disability. A person who gets this would basically just get disadvantage on everything they do for as long as they are on the Ethereal, as they basically just get violently ill. You can't quite get over it until you go back to the normal plane and then return and try again, but the positive here is that if you do manage to find your inner self once in a particular try, then you will typically never have to suffer from it again. So alright. So now you have made it into the deep Ethereal. You have experienced sight, hearing, taste, and ether sickness. You have a place where you want to go. Let's say that you want to go to the plane of air. So what happens now? So in the Ethereal, there is no up, there is no down, no direction whatsoever, just fog everywhere. And to make matters worse, there is no constellation that you can look up to for guidance or a piece of land that you can use as a guide. Though whether you believe it or not, that actually doesn't even matter. We mentioned this before on the last video, but things are not relative to other things in this plane. Now that sounds a bit confusing, but what do I mean? There are no distances anywhere. This is a land where time and space is unconventional. Traveling for 1 hour in a direction and then traveling back to that same direction you just came from for the same amount of time will not put you in the same spot. Location and existence in this plane can sometimes be more of a state of being than it is literal, and so it is movement. This creates a couple of really interesting situations. Quote, "Observers watching an ethereal combat often report that two clashing ethereal figures resemble waves coming together in a prime ocean. Sometimes the waves pass through each other with little harm, and sometimes they crash onto each other with destructive force, lessening portions of themselves." End quote. The movement in this plane is radical and might look to you like something more akin to the way wizards fight in Harry Potter when they are just flying as shadows in the air, crashing onto each other, or maybe something akin to an anime where the entities move so fast that you literally cannot see them. And when you strike one another, your blood and limbs that are cut off are then absorbed by the ethereal realm. Movement in this place is just wild. In any case, going back to our example of how to reach the inner plane of air, all you would have to do is basically just will yourself to go there. Because the plane of air is not in any particular direction or doesn't take any particular place in space, you really can't go wrong with where you go. As long as you're willing yourself to be taken to the plane, you will basically just start moving towards the plane. Though again, think of the process of travel to be less about moving towards a location and perhaps rather as a video game loading bar. The more that you travel as you will yourself to the plane, the more the loading bar fills. But if you ever stop your trajectory, choose a different place to go, and then start moving somewhere else, you basically delete your previous loading bar and create a new one, essentially eliminating any progress that you made on your travel to the previous location. Like I said, there are no distances in this plane. Even if you feel like you've traveled for one entire year in a direction and only diverted for 6 hours, you still need to redo the whole trip. Space is not relative to other spaces in here. Now, as far as how long it would take traveling in this fashion, well, it depends on where you want to go. Finding a free-floating location on the Ethereal realm is actually faster than finding a Demiplane, which is also faster than finding an inner plane or finding the prime material realm. It takes on average about 50 hours to find a free-floating location, about 100 hours to find a Demiplane, and about 500 hours to get to any inner plane or to the prime material realm. Traveling in the deep ethereal is a long process, so be extremely careful if you ever leave the border ethereal and go into the deep, even if you do that for just a few minutes. Stay close to the color wall that leads to your prime world, because if you venture out into the deep, away from your color wall for even just a few minutes, you will have to then spend over 500 hours or more to get back. Now, that being said, you can of course rest and everything or explore a location that you found while on your way to the destination without actually losing your progress on your way to that destination. You just have to be careful to not will yourself to a different place and start travel somewhere else, or that will effectively reset your travel to wherever you were going to before. It is also important to know, as obvious as it might sound, that you must know where you're going in order to actually go there. If traveling to a place that you do know could take as much as 1,000 hours, then traveling to a place you don't know could take entire lifetimes, if even that. So to rephrase that, it is actually impossible to ever get to a place that you don't actually know. You can't just simply sit on the ethereal and say, oh, I want to go to the coolest demiplane, and then just try and will yourself to go there. You actually need to at least know what the place is, if it has a name, and sort of have an understanding of what it is. As long as you can visualize the place, you can typically will yourself to it. So alright. Now that you have experienced the deep and are currently in the midst of your very long voyage to get to the inner plane, what can you find on your way? What kind of creatures could you meet? What's actually out there in the deep ethereal? And because this place is, well, infinite, we're going to have to set our sights a bit smaller and cover just some of the more interesting sights that one can find in here. Otherwise, we will literally be here forever and I would be forced to make a third video on the ethereal, which I guess it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But anyways, there are tons of demiplanes that one can find in here in the deep ethereal. Like I said before, this is where demiplanes are created whenever you cast a spell that makes one, or whenever one gets created for whatever reason. There are a couple of these that are universally well known, like for example, Ravenloft. So this one is a little bit confusing because there is actually a difference between, say, Curse Strahd and Ravenloft. Curse Strahd is set in a land called Barovia, which was a small valley somewhere in a forgotten world in the prime material realm. This land was taken from that planet, snatched, and then put into the Shadowfell by the Dark Powers. This is a process that can happen really to any place and happens every so often on the prime. For example, there is actually an example of this in the Tomb of Annihilation, even though the book didn't actually tell you that, but Artus Cimber gets stuck in a demiplane of dread, similar to that of Curse Strahd. In this location here in Cholt, there was a druid in there who turned evil, and just how Strahd did, sort of cursed the land and formed it into a demiplane of dread. In any case, this is something that happens every so often, and those lands get taken and brought into the Shadowfell. Ravenloft, on the other hand, is different, even different than Curse Strahd. Ravenloft was a campaign setting inspired by the original Curse Strahd. This campaign setting is set in the Demiplane of Dread, which is supposed to float in the ethereal realm. So now that we have a new book coming out, which appears to be a campaign setting for Ravenloft, whatever the place that gets described there should be found in the Ethereal realm. I say should because I don't know if they're basically going to be retconning things or changing things for the Great Wheel cosmology model. I suppose that we will have to see. You never know what changes they decide to make. But that being said, these places are linked to the Shadowfell, at least in the sense that demigods and gods can connect themselves to demiplanes in the Ethereal realm, even from other places in the multiverse. Not that any of this matters much. Locations and time and space, they're all relative here. You can walk into a domain of dread in the Shadowfell and technically now be in a demiplane in the ethereal plane, or you can enter the ethereal realm from the prime, so it's all a little bit just kind of up in the air, to be honest. Regardless, if these domains of dread had a time and a place in the multiverse, they would be in the ethereal and you could directly float to them in the ethereal realm. Man, this is kind of confusing. Though this is also a good time to explain that even though the Deep Ethereal itself has a lot of rules, those only apply to the plane itself and not to any of the demiplanes that reside within. And demiplanes have their own rules and laws, as dictated by the nature of their creation. Some demiplanes might have gravity, some might not, some might have different physics than others, some might bar you entrance in one way or another, or even prevent you from leaving. The demiplanes of dread are a good example of a demiplane that will prevent you from being able to leave once you enter it, whereas Aethys is a good example of a place that would bar you entrance. Aethys is a planet in the prematerial world, the setting for the Dark Sun campaign setting. If you try to materialize onto Aethys from the Deep Ethereal, a world of ash and death, you will automatically fail. Aethys does not have a border ethereal, and if you try and get in, you will be instead trapped in what is known as the Grey, a dreary metaphysical haze that prevents entry onto the planet. Another example of this would be the world of Kryn from the Dragonlance setting. The border ethereal of the realm appears blocked and haunted by ether gaps, which are essentially like black holes in the ethereal realm. And there's also supposed to be tons of creatures born of chaos in this place, and that prevents you from entering. The concept of what's possible and what you can find in the ethereal realm is honestly beyond scope. There is a demiplane in here called the Demiplane that lives. If you enter it, you will find yourself inside a collection of organs, like if you were inside of a body, except that if you explore it, you would realize that the body would have to be the size of continents, and many of its organs are just nonsensical. These living organs have a sentience, however, which calls itself Neth. And as a being, it seeks to understand the nature of its existence, for it itself doesn't even know how it was made. This entity can also produce child-looking avatars imbued with its sentience that constantly scour the ethereal realm looking for answers about how it was born. I mean, things in here can get so wild. There's a demiplane in here called Wormscape. Quote, Wormscape is literally a solid three-dimensional mass of living, writhing worms. The extent of the demiplane remains unmapped, however, there can be no doubt that its expanse is vast. The slick, writhing worms vary in length between 1 inch and 10 feet. Thankfully, the border ethereal does indeed touch this demiplane, so a body knows what she is about to enter. Once a body moves into the demiplane, she's surrounded by worms. The literally billions of worms that comprise this demiplane make an almost subsonic slithering noise as they weave their way in and out of each other's slime-covered bodies. This noise penetrates the ear at some level no matter what precautions a body uses, even magical ones. The origin, true nature, and meaning of Wormscape remains dark. One story has it that Wormscape is merely the outer skin of a hideous entity that exists at its core. If this is true, then Wormscape might actually be the rot of a truly gargantuan being that died long ago, or it might be the byproduct of this creature's ghastly nature." End quote. I just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of Wormscape. It was important to me that you would be told of this place. You're welcome. Another demiplane that is of great importance is the Prison of Tharizdun, known also as the Elder Elemental Evil. So, Tharizdun was a god that attempted to destroy everything that is, and in fact, it was he who ended up creating the Abyss as we know it today. The gods basically banded together in order to imprison him, creating a universe that was completely overtaken by the Abyss. As a form of poetic justice, they basically wanted to imprison him in a place that would echo that which he wanted to bring. Well, this universe, or location, whatever it is rumored to exist within the ethereal plane. It's supposed to be a demiplane. Now, for some context, this is actually the actual bad guy behind the events that transpired in Princes of the Apocalypse, the one who manipulated the Elder Elemental Archons into invading prime material worlds and destroying them. All he can do from this prison is basically whisper sweet nothings into cultists and others in hopes of accomplishing his agenda. Quote, "Lore places this power of evil, insanity, and destruction in a hidden demiplane, supposedly locked away from the rest of the multiverse by other deities fearful of its infinite rage." End quote. Now, those are all just examples of the sorts of demiplanes that you can find in the Ethereal, and there is a lot of interesting stuff, but I just can't go through each of them. Now, remember, demiplanes are typically created by people or gods. Using vast amounts of magic, one can gather the forces that be in the plane of possibility and then make the impossible, well, possible. However, you don't always need to have a creator for these things to happen. Like I said again, in a plane of possibility, well, anything is possible. The ether itself that floats in the realm is creation incarnate. Quote, "The mists of the deep ethereal contain small amounts of existence itself. These tendrils of possibility swirl about the plane, touching and surrounding everything. Sometimes the latent power within the ethereal fog manifests itself as solid ether. Also called protomatter or prima matera by graybeards, this substance is concentrated ethereal mist. Some cutters like to say that solid ether is just a possibility that has moved towards actuality. But it is more than just a philosophical concept. See, a body can touch and hold protomatter in their hand. Depending on its density and stability, this substance can be as fluffy and fleeting as a snowball in a desert, or as oppressive and dangerous as a rockfall in close quarters. Usually, concentrated ether compacts into a solid or semi-solid substance. This substance is generally white, tinged with bluish highlights. If significant amounts of protomatter accumulate, the chance exists for natural demiplane formation. Larger fluctuations in ethereal density cause longer lasting and denser forms of solid ether. Such fluctuations usually come about through natural stresses caused by the flexing of the curtain of vaporous color, ether cyclones, vortex fronts, and other energetic features found on the ethereal. End quote. There are 3 types of prima matera, or protomatter, and the types correspond to how stable or unstable the matter is. The first one is what we call ephemeral. This is what happens if your character simply grabs a part of the ethereal fog and then, I don't know, just squeezes it together in their hands. It will coalesce together into a form of actual material, but then it would quickly just vanish back into the fog after a second or so. 99% of protomatter that is formed in this realm is this type of matter, ephemeral, because it is not stable enough to remain in a predetermined shape. In your hand, this type of matter will feel like a fluffy snowflake, though without being wet or cold. If you then would try and take this into an actual plane or world, it would then simply disappear and disperse. The next stage of protomatter is what we call quintessential. Quintessential matter is rarely formed out of ephemeral protomatter. Typically only 1% of any ephemeral matter created will turn into quintessential, but what it means is that it is a bit more stable and will last longer. Generally, we're talking about a range of about 100 hours to 1000 hours of lasting power. Now, this type of matter would feel to a character like a cork, a relatively dense material that can be squeezed and manipulated if you were to have a decent grip. Mostly this will be formed into the shape of pellets around areas where the ether is being forced together by natural forces within the realm. Though if the circumstances are appropriate, you might even see protomatter like this formed in enormous ways, like big enough to form plates of 1000 feet or more. This material can be worked on like any other in order to form buildings, weapons, objects, and what have you. But again, anything that you create with it will basically deform in just 100 to 1000 hours. Much like shadow magic though, you can actually magically sculpt this essence into actual shapes using illusion magic. Illusion magic is powerful in the ethereal realm, since the nature of the plane here is flush with possibility and resists the imposition of a single and limiting form. Certain spells and effects are empowered while others are limited. For example, spells like Disintegrate, which is meant to break down a body from its stable form, is more powerful here. Magics that deal with creation are also much more effective here, and that would include illusion. Illusion magic in the ethereal realm is so good, but also very dangerous. When you create a new version of a monster using your illusion magic, the particles of possibility in the ether can grant it a semblance of life that a caster might not be accustomed to. As the ether flushes the illusion with creation juice, you will notice that— creation juice, that sounds weird. Anyways, you will notice that if you don't hold any form of concentration on the spell, you can still hold the spell. Further, there is a small chance that the illusion that you created will absorb too much of the ether within it, and then become sentient, becoming an actual creature at that point beyond your control. This can be dangerous because whatever your intentions might have been for the personality of the illusory creature, it might just act differently. Many an illusionist have been slain by its own creations, while others have inadvertently created long-lasting real friendships with their illusions made real. This, however, is not to be taken lightly. The most dreadful and powerful monster in the Ethereal realm, the actual last boss of the Ethereal realm, is in fact one created by such an illusionist who made a terrible, grave mistake. A spellcaster named Hasten of Magecliff once crafted a phantasmal killer on the Ethereal realm, and then paid the price. You probably already see where this is going. Phantasmal Killer creates an illusion in the minds of your target, where the illusion manifests as the target's greatest fear. Then the fear haunts and hurts you. Well, the Phantasmal Killer gained sentience in the Ethereal, and with this sentience, it gained new powers. Now, the created sentient monster takes on the greatest fear of any that it meets, and as it was created to do, it then kills them. Now, what is an adventurer's greatest fear, you might ask? Well, what about a monster that one-shots you if it touches you? What about a monster who is immune to physical and magical attacks? Well, the Fair, as it is called, cannot be harmed by weapons and is invulnerable to magic. And if it touches you, it kills you out of pure fright in one hit. The creature can also pass through most barriers and cannot be stopped. They say that the only way to kill this creature would be to lure it out of the Ethereal into the Primaterial realm or any other realm where its Protomatter essence would then quickly disintegrate into nothingness, as most of this matter does. But how cool is that? Now, there are other spells that also work interestingly and different here in the Ethereal realm, like for example Polymorph. Polymorph has a 25% chance of misfiring and changing the target into a random shape. Spheres of Annihilation create massive ether gaps, which are like massive black holes in the Ethereal realm. You also cannot conjure any monster from the Astral or from the Outer Planes in here. Elemental water spells are easier to cast, while elemental earth is harder to cast. Divination spells also do not work in the ethereal plane. Quote, divinatory spells seek to foretell future events, thus locking in what will happen. Since the ethereal mists are probability incarnate, the act of determining future events and thereby limiting possibilities contradicts the fundamental nature of the entire plane. If a body casts a divinatory spell on the ethereal, it fails, end quote. This same logic follows abjuration spells. Quote, spells of this school are less effective on the ethereal plane due to the opposition between the school's focus and the nature of the plane. See, abjuration spells try to recant, repudiate, or limit an object or effect, but the very medium of the ethereal plane is fraught with possibilities so that nothing is ever really beyond a body's reach. Spells that deny possibility have a limited power when cast ethereally. Thus, all spells from this school function at one level lower than normal. In addition, it is impossible to cast 4th level or higher spells from the Abjuration School on the ethereal plane, end quote. Now, going back to quintessential protomatter, illusion magic can actually sculpt this ethereal matter into real shapes that then retain their form, at least, again, for the 100 to 1000 hours that it will last. Anything that shapes or creates in this realm is just so much more powerful. Quintessential matter, however, whether sculpted or not, will also disintegrate if ever brought outside of the ethereal realm, which again also incorporates any creature created by illusion magic. Now, the last type of matter that you can find here is what we call stable matter, which, as the name implies, it means that the protomatter will simply retain its form virtually forever or until manually destroyed. These formations will keep on very slowly attracting other formations of matter into it, making these islands bigger and bigger. These islands of stable protomatter float in the ethereal, becoming places where one might rest or form communities in. It is believed that if these islands become big enough, they would eventually form into a real demiplane, though nobody has actually ever seen this happen, and some communities even have attempted to make their floating islands of stable protomatter as big as possible in hopes of achieving this end, but currently, unfortunately, with no positive results. Stable protomatter, however, can be indeed brought outside of the ethereal plane, but at that point, it is then reduced to its quintessential form and would then only last for 100 to 1000 hours outside. Now, to finish up the video, let's talk a little bit about gods. And some gods do take particular interest, of course, in this realm, since they have the special ability of creating expansive demiplanes that break the foundations of reality and then connect those realms over to their planes in the outer planes. For example, you have the Lady of Pain, the ruler of the mighty city of Sigil. She has a demiplane in here called the Demiplane of Maces, which is where she sends those who misbehave on Sigil, a prison demiplane meant to castigate those she deems worthy of punishment. The gods of the Forgotten Realms also possess the demiplane here, the Plane of Cynosure, and this is where they meet whenever they need to speak to one another in a neutral zone. If there was ever a dispute between the gods, basically it would be resolved here. Even though the demiplane exists within the ethereal realm, the only way to actually access it would be through portals on the outer plane, portals that could only be activated by the gods themselves. Lastly, it is also here in the ethereal realm where you could find Ptah or Ta-Pa, the traveler god. Now, you might have not heard of this one because it's mostly a spelljammer god, but the essence of it is that this is a god that travels through worlds, or generally just travels through the cosmos. He's considered to be one of the only gods in existence that is actually approachable, especially considering how powerful he is. Basically, you can just randomly find him just roaming in the ethereal, and then at that point, you're able to just strike up a conversation with him, though if he finds you boring, he will teleport you out of his sight. But there you have it. This will be the end of our videos for the ethereal realm. With this, you should now be able to understand the ethereal and how it all works. I didn't really feel the need to go over all the monsters that you can find in here or all of the ethereal unique spells that you can find. Maybe I'll see about putting someone here on the screen for you to see, but yeah, the main purpose of this video here was to give you an idea of how it all works and some of the really cool stuff that you can find and do. For our next video, we'll be covering the inner planes. Specifically, we will be doing the Plane of Fire. So if you have any art that you would like to submit for the Plane of Fire, then make sure to send it over to rhexxart@gmail.com. Anyways, I would like to personally thank my Patreon supporters, Barry Maskant, 5E Magic Shop, Morgan Johnson, Rusty Rain, Biotechnofrag, Doc Feeder, Brad Salazar, Walker Motley, Terry Culp, The Great Codini, Omega Scales, Ozol, Alex Cookson, Stephen, Falky951, Benjamin Bosters, Thomas Hunt, Prince Daylight Morning Crown, Sabim Kurshab, man, my body's giving out, oh boy, Solarensis, Ordoric, Nathan McComb, Silent Shoppa, Bushido Burrito, Werewolven Games, Soulless Rider, Roleplay with Advantage, Mr. Salt, Stalia, Lost Crusader, Tython, Treb909, Garrett, Minnick, JD Green, Tony RC, Famine52, George Futlin, Olaf Kleb, Trevor Hez, Sovereign Mine, Draglogia, Hustur, Ziran King, The Living Guild Pack, Michael Walker, and Striblo for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Alright guys, that's it for this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you next time on the Inner Plane of Fire.